Hello, everyone. Warm welcome to our panelists and to all of you joining us today. My name is Rawaa, and I'm thrilled to be moderating this session. Unfortunately, Her Excellency Dr. Hala was unable to be here in person due to unexpected circumstances, but she did address the summit via a video that we will share with you shortly. Our region and the world has been rocked by one challenge after the other. We are still dealing with the aftermath of the pandemic, which I think we're looking forward to put it behind us. The Russian-Ukrainian war is adding another layer of complexity to the global scene. In the meantime, the war in Gaza, with its profound humanitarian and infrastructural impact, remains crucial to any economic forecasting in the region. We've also been witnessing disruption in the maritime transportation through the Red Sea, which is reshaping trade patterns and trade routes, particularly for the energy market. Now, oil prices have been hovering around $80 a barrel, with fear of disruptions should the situation in the Middle East get worse. Inflation is expected to moderate. However, growth and inflation are projected to be uneven across the GCC and other economies in the region, which is not a surprise. Of course, the potential escalation and widening of the current conflict in the Middle East could further impact the global and the regional growth. There are definitely some stories of resilience in the face of these challenges, but it's also look like we have a lot of uncertainty. In this session, we're going to have an interesting debate on how is our region really holding up today and where are we heading from here. And there's no one better to help us understand these dynamics than our distinguished panelists who need no further introduction, Roberta, Gatti, and Dr. Nasser Saidi. I'll start with you, Roberta. Just a few weeks ago, the World Bank released its economic update for the Middle East, and as a chief economist, you have been instrumental in shaping this report. Can you share with us some of the key findings and projections for both maybe oil exporting and oil importing countries throughout these global uncertainties?
Thank you, Dr. Rawaa, and it's such a pleasure for me to be here today. So I decided to put some graphs to the numbers that we will be discussing just to focus the conversation a little bit. And kind of like the title that we use to describe what's happening to growth in the region is really that the tale of two MENA has ended with a return to lackluster growth. And this is basically because I'm a literature buff. And so I just wanted to put it's quasi-literary citation, but hopefully you will see what that means now. So let's first talk about the MENA region vis-a-vis the rest of the world. And you, Dr. Rawaa, we're talking about, we are recovering from the pandemic. And what you see here is GDP growth in 2020, and you see the MENA region in purple. And clearly we had a deeper dip than other emerging and developing economies that you see here depicted in yellow. We also had a tamer recovery in 2021, and you see that in the distance between the purple and the yellow that is much, much higher. What happened in 2022, however, was kind of a reversal of fortunes. Our region grew at 6%, which was unprecedented, at least in the past decade, while the world was dipping down amidst the conflict in Ukraine, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And what happened in 2023 is that on the wake of epic cuts and the voluntary Saudi cuts on oil, growth dipped down significantly for the region. And the return to lackluster growth is what you see here for 2024, a forecast of 2.7%, which, as Dr. Mahmoud was indicating earlier, is a downgrade from what we had expected in January. Again, two big factors that are weighing in there. One is the geopolitical tension and the high uncertainty. And I was really touched by how important His Excellency saw it as a determinant of how we think about the outlook, uncertainty. And that's exactly what we see in the region. And on the other hand, what's going to happen to oil markets. So there is optimism for 2025 because the idea is that the sort of brakes that were put on oil production will be taken off little by little. Let me just add one thing here, if I still may, is that you see these solid lines, and those are actual growth rates or forecasts for the MENA region, emerging developing country economies, and the world. You also see some dotted lines, which are straight, and that's the average pre-pandemic for these three groups. And so the story is that for 2024, in MENA, we're returning to that lackluster growth because you see that the dotted purple is so much lower than the dotted yellow. And this is something that maybe we can talk a little bit more, which has to do with structural factors in MENA that have determined that lackluster growth. Let me conclude here with a representation of the tale of two MENA. And you, Dr. Rawaa, were asking me to sort of differentiate a little bit between oil exporters and oil importers. So you see, for example, here, GCC countries in green and the oil importers in red. And for 2022, you see that massive divergence in growth for these two groups of countries. What is happening? I hinted at it earlier. Oil prices shot up and benefited oil exporters, and you see that reflected in growth rates for GCC countries on average of about 8%. But that very same shock was detrimental to oil importing countries because food prices increased, and that was and at the same time when interest rate rose, countries such as Egypt and Tunisia found themselves with higher inflation. In the case of Egypt, significant depreciation of their currency and also higher debt burden. And then you see how the tale of the two MENA comes to an end across these two groups of countries and returns to a modest growth that we really would like to lift up, which is what His Excellency was saying earlier. Not 3.9. I really would like to see 7. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Roberta, for these insights. And I think it's a great transition to my next question, Dr. Nasser. Dr. Nasser, we know that for sustainable growth, job creation relies heavily on the private sector and not only on governments, right? We also know that following the Arab Spring, there has been some nations shifted back more, public sector models or approach. And we keep hearing that in the next decade, more than 100 million people in the MENA region are expected to be to join the workforce. So my question is, maybe if you can give us your opinion on what are the current, trends or employment trends in the region. How well are we doing in creating jobs, basically?
Right, thank you. And first of all, happy Labor Day. This is 1st of May. I'm an economist, so I'm a practitioner of the dismal science, as they call it. So you mentioned the number of 100 million.
Mm-hmm.
We've been hearing that number for a long time.
Yeah.
And we need to put it a little bit on perspective. The estimated labor force of the Arab world is around 130 million. So when we're talking about 100 million, you're just about doubling and more what's coming in. But let's take some numbers because I think it's instructive. First, our unemployment rate in the Arab world is around 9.8%. So substantially higher than it is elsewhere. More than that, some 17 million young people want a job, but unlikely are not able to find it. So the job gap rate is about 24%. Employment rate for youth is around 19%. The employment rate for adults is around 53% compared to much lower number, 19%. More important, young people, and that's what we really need to care about. If you look at the number of young people not in employment, education, or training, that number is 11 million. Okay, so there's some 11 million there, what we call needs. Out there. Female labor force, and then I'll get to some positive stories, but we need to remember these. Female labor force participation rate is around 19%. Male labor force participation is about 74%. Overall, it's 49%. And on average, the income of women, if you look at that, is about 12.5% that of men. So what is this occurring? The first number, the 9.8%, is that we did not recover from COVID, not fully. The GCC economies did much better. And if you look at labor per population, the GCC employment, it's about double what it is in the non-GCC countries. So the tale of two MENAs is actually a tale, in fact, of three MENAs, which I want to come back to. You've got the GCC countries, which recovered quickly from COVID because vaccination rates were very high. UAE in particular opened up to the rest of the world, attracted tourism. And then the most important thing is that the GCC countries realized that the economic diversification level, which I called economic diversification 1.0, that is focusing on trade, logistics, transport, etc., got hit the worst because of COVID. Everything shut down. So they're shifting now to economic diversification 2.0, focusing much more on digital, high-tech, renewables, climate, and related issues. So much more sustainable. So that's the story, I think, of the GCC. Very different story from the non-GCC. And the third part, those countries that continue to live the consequences of violence and war. Right? I mean, when we look across the countries, you've got the non-GCC, we mentioned Egypt and others, and then you've got a third set of countries, the Yemen, the Iraq, Syria, and others who are living a different story. So what are some of the consequences, I think, which is important? The first one is you need to deal with informality. Much of the activity that takes place, particularly employment of people, is in the informal market. You need to move them into the formal market. Number two, you need to focus on education. Education. And in particular, you need to start focusing on digital education for the digital economy. That is critical. I have a grandson in Hong Kong. He's 5. He's going to be entering kindergarten school when he's 5. They are going to be teaching him how to coding at 5. What are we doing in our part of the world to prepare our youth who are the bulk of the 100 million people going to be coming? So digital education is going to be a critical one. Other aspect is you need to diversify your economies. We're too highly dependent on oil. So how do we go about doing that? You've asked about that. How do we go into high tech where the new jobs and high incomes get created? So I think some of those challenges are there. There are some very bright points, particularly the increased participation of women. You look at Saudi Arabia, the participation of women more than doubled in 3 years. So they're getting attracted. And the reason why women are so important is that they come to have a competitive advantage in services. And the services economy globally and in our part of the world is the fastest growing. So there's some positive vibes coming from
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Nasser. I think I want to build on that first part, and I'm really interested in informality because was my thesis in my PhD. So I've worked extensively on it on the MENA region. But going back to Roberta, I want to go back to the private sector for a minute. In the face of those global economic and geopolitical shifts, how can the private sector really be nurtured? What can we do in a way? What can we do better or faster to support it and protect it? Since from the World Bank perspective, you might have exposed to other models in the region.
Well, Dr. Rawaa, I think this is actually the perfect segue from talking about informality, because informality, as widespread as it is really a failure of the economy to seize the potential of the region. Earlier, the panel was talking about the demographic dividend, the potential for growth. Informality is essentially production that happens at very low levels of productivity. So what comes in the way? So you asked me about private sector, but I'm going to give you an answer about the role of government. And so something that we have pursued, both analytically and in terms of dialogue with the government at the World Bank, is really to try to discuss how the relationship between the public sector and the private sector can be rebalanced. And what do I mean by that? Think about state-owned enterprises. State-owned enterprises are extraordinarily prevalent in the MENA region. So we had a study and we looked at 29 sectors in the economy. And we looked at just the prevalence, whether there are SOEs in these sectors. So Egypt, 29 sectors. SOEs are present in 29 sectors of the economy. The Kingdom, 29 sectors. SOEs are present in 22. Morocco, 29 sectors. SOEs are present in 18 of these sectors. If you look at the OECD average, the number is 12. So what is happening? One way to put it is that there is a really heavy footprint of the state that really creates an imbalance and a sort of lack of competitive neutrality between state-owned enterprises and the private sector. What do I mean by an example? State-owned enterprises have, for example, privileged access to credit. This displaces the private sector. And if the private sector cannot compete, then it won't be able to create the jobs that are needed to really pay into one of the most incredible wealth that our region has, which is its people and its youth. So if you were to ask me what the one thing that can happen, I would really hope that the government in our region move away from being the protagonist of the show to being the sort of enabling, maybe the producer in the show. And so through sort of really creating that sort of level playing field between public and private. Let me help there.
No, it's perfect, because my next question to you was about debt. So I think it's a perfect transition. The World Bank report actually highlights some countries in the region are facing difficulties in managing their debt. And 2 days ago at the World Economic Forum meetings in Riyadh, I think was the president of WEF, Mr. Brand, they stated, and I'm quoting, "We haven't seen this kind of debt since the Napoleon Wars." Now, we know that many countries in the GCC are implementing some fiscal consolidation measure, but what is the situation really like with these global high level of interest rates that we're seeing? How sustainable these debts are, and how worried should we be about this situation?
Okay, so that's an important question, which I'm not going to answer.
Okay.
In that form. However, maybe we can talk about what we see.
I think Dr. Nasser would.
Dr. Saidi. However, I think you're correct in saying that there has been a dramatic increase in debt worldwide. And we also saw it in the region going in the past 10 years from 22%, I believe, to 44% of GDP. So why do we worry about that? It's because if the debt to GDP ratio increases, interest rate can increase, private sector activity gets crowded out, if interest payments are very high, and you were referring to the fact that we are in a high interest rate environment, then the government does not have enough resources to pay for essential government service. Just to give you an example, in Egypt at the moment, interest payments on the debt are 8% of GDP. And that means half of its revenues, half of its collective revenue. That's a lot. If you think that other half needs to go to paying for health, education, and all that comes, ways to sort of maintain society. So we should worry about high public debt. If we think about our region, clearly, the oil importing countries are the countries that have been in seeing deeper problems. A couple of myths that I wanted to debunk here while I'm not answering your question on sustainability. So, first of all, yes, the pandemic increased our public debt to GDP ratio significantly in our region by 11 percentage points. That's a lot. But the increase in debt preceded the pandemic. And we saw it very clearly in Egypt. We saw it very clearly in Tunisia. We actually saw it around the world, but the gradient is much higher in oil importing countries. The second one is that I think there's sort of a adage that goes among economists is that, well, if you have public debt, you can grow out of it. And so what we try to answer in this report is like, okay, have our countries been able to effectively grow out of that? And the intuition is very simple. That to GDP ratio, the GDP is the denominator. If the denominator grows, the whole ratio should go down. And so the answer is that not really. And so what we saw is that even in countries that had solid growth, at the same time as growth was going up, debt stocks were going up. Why? Because some countries had depreciation of their currency that made their foreign denominated wealth much more expensive. And some countries had significant below the line spending. I'm happy to return to that later. And then another myth that I wanted to debunk is that, at least for MENA, I'm not saying for the rest of the world, but Dr. Mahmoud was talking earlier about inflation and how we saw high inflation in Egypt and how now it's, the new announcement have marked a change. But in the past decade, there has been high inflation, at least for the past 4 years. So it's like, okay, if there's high debt, then we can dilute it away with inflation. Did that happen? And the answer here is also no. Because as inflation was raging, also these debt stocks were increasing. So, and I spoke a lot about the oil importing countries, where debt to GDP ratio on average is 88%, and that's why I kind of put the worry first. So for those countries, the fiscal consolidation is a must, but also that transparency. Because when spending happens below the line, you really can only manage what you measure, and that's going to be very complicated. I'm happy to conclude on oil exporting countries. Clearly, the situation is not as worrisome. They have an average debt to GDP ratio of 34%, but then what we see is massive variability. And this is driven, not fully, but mostly, by oil prices. And although they've been able to buffer this variability, sovereign wealth funds, what we really want is to diversify. So let me stop there.
Thank you so much, Roberta. I don't want to conclude on that. I think maybe on something more positive. So, Dr. Nasser, we have long discussed in the region, regional economic integration. We've been talking about this for years now. As a way to create jobs, to enhance resilience, to attract investment. Now, we have seen some developments, right? We've seen, some cooperation here and there on electricity. We've seen the agreement just a couple of days ago between UAE, Iraq, Qatar, and Turkey, the $17 billion one for the alternative to the Suez Canal. We've seen the ABC agreement. But we're still very far from the full potential and what a regional integration could actually mean and what are the benefits we can get out of it. How do you see this agenda translating into action, and what does it really take us to get there?
Right. I need to start at a much higher level in terms of what's happening today and why regional integration is much more important for us. At a global level, you're having increasing fragmentation and dislocation of the global economy. What is emerging now is effectively two big blocks. The US on the one side, Europe and its allies, Then on the other side, let's call them China, its allies, maybe the BRICS countries, call it the South. If you look at restrictions now, fragmentation, last year some 3,000 new trade restrictions were introduced. That is 3 times what it was in 2015. You now have a weaponization of the US dollar. You have fragmentation of capital flows. If you put that picture together in terms of the growing restrictions and fragmentation, and the IMF has been doing some excellent work on this, the IMF is warning that if this breakup happens between the two blocs, you're going to lose the cost to GDP, global GDP, is between 2 to 7%. That is enormous. So what we're talking about is potentially, we are living a new Cold War. Let's be very clear. There's a new Cold War happening. What does it mean for us in this part of the world? And what does it mean for the GCC in particular? For us, and in particular the GCC, in my view, we need to take the steps to benefit from this global dislocation. Regional integration plays a critical role. The GCC countries now have the infrastructure, they're developing trade relations. Look at the UAE, comprehensive economic partnership agreements with India and a whole host of other countries. When you open up trade, you create job opportunities, you create possibilities for innovation, you create possibilities for investment in new industries. The big challenge that we have on the other side is the energy transition. So how have we responded to that? We've been responding to that in the GCC by going towards renewable energy, clean technology, climate tech. So the very positive thing, and I want to build this story, this part of the world is going to be unique in being the old energy hub, oil and gas hub, plus the new energy hub, clean technology, renewable technology, hydrogen, climate tech. This is unique. But also, the GCC countries are doing what the Arab countries did not do before. They are integrating the non-GCC economies into their economies. Why is that important? So you mentioned Egypt, you mentioned other projects. So gradually they're integrating them into there. The reason why that's important is what I call regionalized globalization. By integrating the non-GCC countries into the GCC economies, you make them enter global supply chains. Once they enter global supply chains, you allow them to benefit from increased job creation. So the bottom line for me is the following. We need to take the steps in this part of the world. I'm talking GCC right now. We have the capital, we have the infrastructure, we have the political willingness to integrate. We need to emerge as what I call middle powers. We're going to be middle powers between the two blocks. And I think we have the means and the tools to do that. So the positive thing, I think, is that as you go towards increased diversification, increased integration, we will assume a lot of power. We already have soft power. Look at how the UAE in particular hosted COP28, etc., and Expo. We now need to build on that by integrating the other countries of the region, and that integration is going to be positive for both. It's probably the only light on the horizon in what is a fairly dismal global economy.
Perfect. Thank you, Dr. Nasser. I had one more question that Roberta was not going to answer anyways, so I think we can conclude. Please join me in thanking our panelists today for their insights and enjoy the rest of the panel. I knew.